Imagine if the Chinese government had access to every Tom, Dick, and Harry in America, and they had the ability to know what your bank account is, what it looks like, what your income is, and if you're in financial difficulty.
Today I sit down with investor Kyle Bass, founder and chief investment officer of Heyman Capital Management, and a founding member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China.
It is, I think, the single largest threat to the West in the last 50 years, and it's being overshadowed by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine.
We discuss the dangers of China's new digital currency, the E-Yuan, and why Kyle Bass believes the Chinese regime is actually intentionally crashing its housing market.
China today is 350% banking assets to GDP, with real estate collapsing. You can just do back of the envelope math and realize that they are having a real financial crisis.
And we take a closer look at the strengthening China-Russia alliance.
China's banking system allowed UnionPay to step in and provide the dollar payment systems for the Russian banks. Now, have we sanctioned UnionPay? No. Have we sanctioned the Chinese banks? No.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Gelik. Kyle Bass, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Glad to be back, Ellen.
So, last time we talked, it was about a year ago. We talked about the Chinese digital yuan and basically the threat that poses. You described it as an existential threat. It's basically the social credit system on steroids, impacting many other countries. So now with this Russia-Ukraine war happening and the Chinese posture on that, we see the digital yuan kind of accelerating in use. I don't know if it's accelerating a lot or a bit, but why don't you tell us?
Yeah, sure. So, with the advent of the Olympics in Beijing, we call them the Genocide Games, happening earlier this year, one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party did was force the participants to enroll and download the E-Yuan app and force them to use it as their payment system while in Beijing. That, of course, begins the forcible use of the E-Yuan. And what I mean by that is China's rollout will be they can definitely force it on their own population, but their goal in this global rollout of the E-Yuan is multi-pronged. The first prong is they really want to try to lessen their dependence on the U.S. dollar. Right, about 87% of global transactions that China settles are settled in dollars. Right, they're desperately short energy, they're desperately short food, they're desperately short basic materials. They have to go buy these things every day around the world. And no one trusts their currency, and they still have a closed capital account. And so what do they have to do? They have to use their dollars to do so. So what they're trying to do, number one, is lessen their reliance on dollars. And maybe even closer to number one, 1A, is they are trying to basically export the Chinese tech stack into everyone in the developed West and East all over the world. And what that means is this isn't a simple digital payment app. This is an app that tracks where you are, what your name is, what your social security number is, what all of your identifiers are. It has location ability, and it also gives a direct line from the Chinese government to an individual outside of the purview of law enforcement, outside of the umbrella or oversight of banking regulators. Imagine if the Chinese government had access to every Tom, Dick, and Harry in America, and in Europe and in Canada, and they had the ability to know what your bank account is, what it looks like, what your income is, and if you're in financial difficulty. Imagine if they could cross-run an algorithm that says, let's look for U.S. government employees that have Tinder, that are short on cash, and maybe they're married, and we can corrupt them immediately, right? It gives them the ramp to corrupt anyone and everyone around the world that's corruptible, which is a real national security problem. So it's a way they can export digital authoritarianism. It's a way they can export their coercion, their bribery, and everything they do in the Belt and Road countries around the world. It is, I think, the single largest threat to the West in the last 50 years. And it's being overshadowed by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many articles have you seen on the E-Yuan in the last 3 months? Almost none, right? There are a few. But it is not top of mind, and it needs to be top of mind.
Well, and so arguably, right, basically Russia with the Russian central bank being sanctioned, right? Russia has been looking for other ways of doing payments. I think Hungary has said they're okay, we'll use the ruble to pay for energy. And the Chinese regime is aligning with Russia. I mean, we're talking about the genocide games, right? They signed a very tight agreement. Maybe I know this is something that you're, very up on. Maybe you can kind of tell us about that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the world needs to go back and reread the February 4th joint communique between Xi and Putin. They issued a public press release, and it goes line by line on what their new strategic partnership is going to look like, that no areas of strategic cooperation are, quote, off limits, which of course means hypersonics, nuclear, all of the good and bad things that they could possibly be working together on. In there, Putin and Russia basically endorse the concept of the reunification of the Taiwanese separatists, and then part and parcel the Chinese endorse Russia's realignment of Mother Russia and basically usurping the Ukraine again. They say it. They come out and tell you who they are, what they're going to do, and that they're basically forming the new axis of authoritarians between China, Russia, and the rest of the bad guys around the world. And I think what this war is doing is forcing that bifurcation of the world into the rules-based, human rights-based developed West and the axis of authoritarians. And I think that will continue to move in those directions very quickly over the coming years.
One of the big challenges is, and I have to mention this, is that the rules-based order itself is suffering a bit. And you have a lot of people, sort of wondering, hey, wow, it's like we have to pick between two not so great situations. What are your thoughts on that, quickly?
I know there's been a huge wedge or set of divisive rhetoric in the U.S., really that Trump accelerated with his antics. Many of the things Trump did with foreign policy were right on spot, but they were overshadowed by him being a little bit of a buffoon in kind of his personal life and even in how he interacts with the rest of the world. That split, and let's just focus on U.S. politics. We can go to Canada, we can go to Europe, we can go wherever you want to go. But in the U.S., that divide's never been wider. The radicals have pushed both parties so far on both sides that I actually feel like they're coming back a little bit, even though they're trying to double down in rhetoric, but they're realizing that this experimentation on the radical left and radical right has gone too far. And I think when you look at the U.S. throughout history, whenever we are involved in a great conflict or have a really large problem, we tend to come together pretty quickly. And there are some things that the administration comes together on. Think about the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, passed almost unanimously with one idiot voting against it. So where do you think Republicans and Democrats agree? They agree on democracy. They agree on rule of law. They agree on punishing those that basically tear up international agreements. And so I realize that there is this division, and you and I both know on social media who is sowing this division. It's China and Russia with their propaganda wars every single day, putting thousands and millions of bots on Twitter and Facebook, and they're attacking literally daily. And you can see their alter egos and the fact that they're all pseudonyms, and you can see what they do. So I think, look, in the grand scheme of things, I think the West will come together like you saw NATO immediately come together. I don't think Putin bet on NATO not being divided on this. Now, clearly, Germany has some issues that it needs to deal with to really feel like NATO is all completely put together. But I think we're going to see the West really come together as we move forward. And, I think the war between Russia and Ukraine is going to get worse before it gets better.
I think the fact that the Chinese Communist Party and Russia right now are working so tightly together, and arguably a number of people on this show have actually argued that it's essentially that Chinese support that's allowed Russia to do what it's doing in the first place, the knowledge that basically China has got its back in the first place. that kind of breaks down a lot of the kinds of narratives out there that I'm hearing, because we know exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is around, and we know how tight this cooperation is. I guess my question is, one, how much is this, these de-dollarization efforts that you described earlier, how much is that really accelerating now, right, through this bifurcation that you're describing? Is that actually a real thing? Is it a concern?
It's a major concern of mine. It's a major concern of the US DoD, Canadian DoD, the allies in Europe. It is a major concern behind the scenes. For some reason, it's not in the media. And the powers that be are focused on this, but it might not even be the right powers. It's DoD and intelligence are really focused on it, but let's say in the US, God bless Janet Yellen, but she doesn't have a national security bone in her body. We need someone in Treasury that really understands the potential impact that the E-yuan can have on the West over time. And there are some senators that you'll see in the coming weeks are going to launch legislation to outlaw its use. And I believe that legislation must happen. I know it sounds hyperbolic to say the Chinese don't have a right to issue their digital currency. They have the right to do whatever they want to do internally, but that should not be used by anyone in the West if we know what's good for us. So they are on the rollout, Jan. It has not taken hold, and they have not forced its use yet on U.S. and Western companies and their management teams, but that's coming.
Well, Russia obviously has been reduced in its ability to use the dollar, right?
Not very much.
Okay, so that's interesting.